As the 20th century dawned, it was in a world dominated by Europe. Rich, strong, technologically advanced, the great powers stood at the head of empires spanning the globe. With the exception of the United States, it was thought no other nation could challenge them. Not in Africa, not in the Middle East, and certainly not in Asia, where no country had defeated the Europeans in the entire modern era. For many, this was just the natural order of things, a world in which all other races cowered before the superior white man. Yet that superior man was about to get a bit of a rude awakening because a new power was rising, one that would soon visit upon one of Europe's Goliaths, a shocking defeat. The name of that power? Japan, and its 1905 victory over Russia would change the course of history. Kicking off with a surprise attack on a fleet in harbour, the Russo-Japanese War was like a sneak preview of the decades of carnage to come. Fought on land and sea, its mechanized killing prefigured the horrors of World War I, even as its victors learned lessons they would implement in a wholly different world war. If the tail end of the 19th century in Europe was the tale of dominating the globe, in Asia it was something far more melancholy. The slow decline of a once great nation. China's descent from mighty empire to half-dead corpse being picked over by colonial vultures was a great humiliation for Beijing, one that still causes pain to this day. For other powers at the time, though, it was nothing to mourn. Oh no. Instead, China's apparent death meant only opportunities to scavenge. One of the biggest predators circling the dying empire was Russia. Back in the 1500s, the European Empire had started expanding east, crossing the Ural Mountains, engulfing Siberia, eventually getting all the way to the Pacific. In the 1850s, Russian subjects began settling at the mouth of the Amur River, a region the Chinese considered theirs. But with the Middle Kingdom in freefall, there wasn't a whole lot that the Qing Dynasty could do. By 1860, St. Petersburg had wrestled a treaty out of Beijing, establishing Russian control over a swath of territory that stretched all the way down to the Korean Peninsula. There, on a spit of land jutting out into the ocean, they established one of history's great ports, Vladivostok. At least, it was great so long as it was summer. The trouble with Vladivostok is that it gets cold in winter, like really cold. So cold that brass monkeys have nightmares about it. That meant Russia's new Pacific port was unusable several months a year, so guys like the Tsar's finance minister, Sergei Witte, decided to start casting about for a warm water upgrade. They found it in the province of Manchuria. A huge region above what is today North Korea, Manchuria was fertile, resource-rich, and most importantly for Witte, home to the Liaodong Peninsula, a sort of Vladivostok for people who enjoy normal temperatures. Sadly for Witte, though, there was another power that had interests in the same region, a new empire rising as surely as the morning sun. We're talking, of course, about Japan. After spending centuries as the nation-state equivalent of Hikikomori, Japan emerged from Edo isolation in 1868 with the Meiji Restoration. Rather than stepping blinking into the sunlight, though, the new government had hit the ground running. Going all in on modernization, Tokyo had managed to leap from an essentially feudal society to an industrial nation in record time. Across the Korea Strait, this had not gone unnoticed. The last major Asian player in our story, Korea in this era was nominally independent, but really under the perfumed boot of Imperial China. Come the 1880s, though, a bunch of Korea's elites were all like, why are we shackled to this dying empire when we could be hanging out with all the cool kids over in Tokyo? In 1884, this pro-Japan faction staged a coup China swiftly came in to crush. By the time the dust had settled, though, one thing was clear. China was no longer strong enough to control Korea alone. At the convention of Tientsin, Beijing was forced to agree to a clause saying in future it wouldn't place troops in Korea without informing Tokyo. And you better believe the Japanese were ready to enforce this with bullets. Fast forward 10 years, and a Korean peasant rebellion broke out. The hows and whys are not important. What is important is that China again sent troops in, only someone forgot to tell Japan. In retaliation, Tokyo launched the first Sino-Japanese War, a year-long beatdown that saw the Qing's butts kicked up and down the entire peninsula. In the aftermath, Beijing was forced to sign the humiliating Treaty of Shimonoseki, giving up their rights over Korea, agreeing to pay a massive indemnity, and surrendering a cubic hecton of territory. Along with this territory was the Liaodong Peninsula. For Sergei Witte, the news that Japan had nabbed this new war water port must have been like quietly bidding on a fancy painting at an auction, only for a random guy to suddenly show up and buy the entire auction house. So he grabbed two brawny buddies and figuratively chased Japan out into the parking lot to get his prize back. The triple intervention was Russia, Germany, and France cornering Japan and essentially saying, hey, guess what, man? You're gonna try to keep our territory if you know what's good for you. All right? In return for additional money, Japan was forced to hand back the peninsula. But while it would be on paper returned to China, in reality, it would go straight to Sergei Witte. Back in 1881, the future Tsar Nicholas II had come to Vladivostok and laid a ceremonial stone marking the end point of the Trans-Siberian Railway. Now, in 1896, it was this continent-spanning rail line that Sergei Witte would use to secure his new peninsula. As Nicholas's coronation got underway in Moscow, Witte took the Chinese ambassador to one side to negotiate a secret deal. In return for helping pay off their indemnity to Japan, the Qing would allow Russia to build a line from Vladivostok across Manchuria and on to the Liaodong Peninsula. The line would publicly be a joint venture, but really, it would be owned by Russians and it would be run by Russians, and most importantly, it would be guarded by Russians. Lots and lots of heavily armored Russians. Work began in the summer of 1897, and before long, an entire Russian army was stationed along the track in Manchuria. At the same time, the Qing agreed to lease the natural harbour at the end of the Liaodong Peninsula to St. Petersburg for 25 years. But when the Russians showed up, it wasn't a temporary structure they started building. Port Arthur, as anyone with even half a brain could see, was going to be permanent, just like the Russian naval fleet that was now building up there. And as dudes in possession of more than just 50% of their cerebrums, the Japanese were not exactly happy. This was meant to be their new territory, spoils of a war Russia had done nothing to help them win. To watch these Europeans blithely take over the peninsula by stealth must have been about as appetizing as a plate of regurgitated natto. But what could Tokyo do? The more Witte's shiny new port and railway grew, the more Russian troops flooded in to protect them, effectively turning Manchuria into a colony. And the Qing were about to hand St. Petersburg the perfect excuse for making their new colony even stronger. Breaking out in 1899, the Boxer Rebellion was an anti-foreigner uprising in China that killed somewhere in the region of 100,000 people. Co-opted by the Qing, it saw Christians murdered, cities overrun, and the embassy district in Beijing laid siege to. The fact it didn't succeed was thanks entirely to an invasion by an 8-nation alliance hastily cobbled together between the US, Germany, Japan, Britain, France, Russia, Italy, and Austria-Hungary. An alliance that in 1901 finally brought the Boxers down. At which point, Russia basically went, alright, great, I'm just gonna leave all these soldiers here. Alright? Despite a legal obligation to withdraw, the Tsar left 100,000 troops in Manchuria on top of the tens of thousands already guarding the line. Sergei Witte was actually against this, thinking it needlessly provocative. But then, needless provocation was apparently what Nicholas II was all about. That fall 1901, Tokyo sent recently retired Prime Minister Ito Hirobumi to St. Petersburg to negotiate a diplomatic solution. Ito's plan was to tell the Russians, look, you got special interests in Manchuria. Fine. Recognize our special interests in Korea, and we'll just call the whole thing quits. But when the Tsar heard Ito was in town, he first kept him waiting, then abruptly refused the meeting. For Ito, it was a calculated slap in the face, a snub designed to show not just what the Tsar thought of his offer, but of Japan in general. Nicholas C. was one of those early 20th century Europeans who happily referred to Asians, and this is a quote, yellow monkeys. He thought them so inferior as to be barely worth his time. The trouble with calculated snubs, though, is that sometimes those receiving them make calculations of their own. In Japan's case, that calculation was that war was inevitable. From Russia, Ito was sent to London, where he got the ball rolling on a treaty with staggering implications. Announced in January 1902, the Anglo-Japanese Alliance committed Britain and Japan to mutual defense if either of them went to war with two or more opponents. That two or more bit is key because Russia at this time was allied with France, a maritime power with an Asian base that it could call on in any Pacific war. But if responding to that call meant Paris would face a European war with London, well, it might just convince La République Française to leave the Russians hanging. Not that Nicholas could see how it had just been played. As 1903 dawned, he unveiled a whole new wave of provocations calculated to make Tokyo piss blood. Instead, his massive, racist miscalculation would very nearly end his reign. As we move through this next section, Nicholas's actions are going to get crazier and crazier until it starts to feel like he's just hoping for conflict. The key point to remember, though, is that Nicholas wasn't a warmonger. He was just so sure the Japanese were inferior that he thought he could get away with acting like a He thought there was no way that Tokyo could take St. Petersburg even if a war did break out. Hence, brazen, half-assed schemes like the Yalu River Timber Company. Lying between Japan's desired colony of Korea and Russia's undeclared colony of Manchuria, the Yalu River Valley was rich in forests just itching to be cut down. So a guy called Bezobrazov came up with a plan. Why not send in soldiers dressed as loggers to go do that cutting? Once they'd lulled the Japanese into a false sense of security by singing a few verses of "I'm a lumberjack and I'm okay," they'd pull out their guns, march down, and annex Korea. When Sergei Witte heard this, he was like, dude, that is literally the dumbest plan. Only a weapons-grade moron could possibly sign off on something so stupid. Which probably explains why Nicholas was all like, sweet, nice plan, let's do it. In August 1903, the Tsar fired Witte. Disguised soldiers were sent to the Yalu River. Able to see what was happening, the Japanese made a last furious attempt at diplomacy. In October, diplomats began a series of discussions with their Russian counterparts. But Nicholas simply didn't take the negotiations seriously. He spent forever ignoring Japanese messages like Tokyo was some bad date that he didn't quite have the heart to properly ghost. Faced with such stony silence, the Japanese came to a frightening conclusion. The Russians were stalling for time to prepare for war. Now, that wasn't true. War would have been expensive and time-consuming for St. Petersburg, even if Russia would obviously win. The problem, though, is that Tokyo really believed an attack was coming, that they needed to strike now to ensure they weren't caught with their pants down. On the night of February the 8th, 1904, Admiral Togo Heihachiro quietly led a fleet of torpedo boats to Port Arthur, where Russia's new Pacific Fleet waited. Under the cover of darkness, they launched the most consequential sneak attack on a naval base this side of Pearl Harbor. To say the Battle of Port Arthur caught the Russians off guard is to severely underestimate just how unprepared they were for such a brazen assault. Heihachiro's torpedo boats smashed holes in the three biggest vessels, even managing to damage the lead ship cruiser Pallada. The Japanese then trapped the remains of the Russian fleet in the harbor, their long-range naval guns preventing escape. Not that an escape was out of the question. Despite the advantage of surprise, the Japanese ships should have been no match for a determined Russian breakout. But the admiral in charge of the Port Arthur fleet, Yevgeni Alekseyev, was simply too cautious. By hesitating, he allowed Heihachiro to pin the Russian Pacific Fleet down in port, a decision that arguably cost Russia the war. Not that anyone at the time realized it was so significant. Russia, after all, was a vast European power, able to call up 3 million men. By contrast, Japan could count on maybe 600,000. And while the Pacific fleets were roughly the same size, Russia was a maritime power with more fleets that it could dispatch east if necessary. Hence Nicholas's reaction to the attack on Port Harbor. When he got the telegram, he was less, oh my god, we're screwed, and more like, let's go teach Tokyo a lesson. But there were a few key details that old Nicky was forgetting. While they might have the larger army overall, Russia only had 100,000 men in the Far East, men who couldn't quickly be reinforced thanks to the ongoing work on the Trans-Siberian Railway. Nor was Russia as technologically or militarily advanced as other European powers that had recently sent swaths of specialists to Japan to help them upgrade their army and navy. In other words, the war that had just blown up wouldn't be the cakewalk Nicholas thought it would be. But even if he had grasped the issues facing him, there's no way the Tsar could have predicted just how shocking, bloody, and destructive this conflict was going to be. Within days of the Port Arthur attack, Japan was shipping soldiers to Korea in preparation for an invasion of Manchuria. This was dangerously cavalier. While the Russian fleet might be trapped in Port Arthur, the Japanese blockade wasn't impenetrable. One officer, Stepan Osipovich Makarov, had even got in the habit of sailing out daily to harass the Japanese ships. Had Makarov broken the blockade, Russia could have retaken control of the seas and screwed up Tokyo's career plans. But fate was apparently smiling on Japan, because during exactly such a breakout attempt in April, Makarov's ship ran straight into a mine. The explosion decapitated the admiral and sank the battleship Petropavlovsk, depriving in one burst of fire the Russians of both their best officer and one of their best ships. While revenge attacks would take out 2 Japanese ships, the death of Makarov ended the Pacific Fleet's hopes of escape. For the rest of the year, the war's main action would take place on land. From their landing spots in Korea, the Japanese First Army was soon marching north up toward the source of all this trouble, the Yalu River Valley. On May the 1st, a force of 40,000 strong descended on a Russian garrison of 7,000 at what is now Siniju in North Korea. With lopsided troop numbers like those, you could probably guess the outcome. The Russian defeat at the Battle of Yalu River managed to be both minor and epoch-shaking. Minor, because this relatively small Russian force still inflicted heavy casualties on the Japanese before retreating safely into Manchuria. Epoch-shaking, because this was the first time in modern history Japan had defeated a Western nation in battle. And as we'll soon see, it wasn't going to be the last. Across May, the Japanese advanced over the Yalu River, one force heading into Manchuria proper, another marching on the Liaodong Peninsula to cut off Port Arthur. On May the 26th, the Battle of Nanshan saw an outnumbered Russian force overwhelmed and forced into retreat, severing the port's land-based supply lines. But the real story was the Battle of Liaoyang. Taking place around the city of the same name, it was the first major land battle of the entire war. Starting on August the 25th, 130,000 Japanese attacked an entrenched Russian force of 180,000, tasked with defending the railway line. What followed were 9 days of bitter fighting. 9 days in which the attacking Japanese were mowed down by the hundreds, in which Japanese shells rained destructively on the Russian fortifications. At last, on September the 3rd, Russian commander Alexei Kuropatkin sounded a retreat. As the city was abandoned, the Russian forces withdrew back to Mukden, deep in the heart of Manchuria. There they could rely on 30,000 fresh troops arriving every month via the railway, a vital relief. Utterly exhausted, their resources stretched thin, the Japanese, for their part, were unable to give chase. The great decisive battle some in Tokyo had dreamed of had failed to materialize. Still, operations on the Liaodong Peninsula had at least succeeded in cutting off Port Arthur. And despite renewed breakout attempts, the naval blockade still just about held, nor could the fleet expect any help. Up in Vladivostok, Russia's other Pacific ships had also been trapped, without any vessels to take the fight to Japan on the open seas. The war was as good as over, hence the fateful decision Nicholas made that autumn. As bad news flooded back from the east, the initial upswell of patriotism in Russia had given way to raw disbelief. Disbelief that was mixing with anger, not just at the generals running the war, but at the Tsar himself. To head off that anger, Nicholas ordered the Baltic fleet under Admiral Zinovi Petrovich Rozhdestvenski to sail to Japan and relieve Port Arthur. It was a borderline crazy gamble. With Britain allied with Japan, the Baltic fleet couldn't take the shortcut via the Suez Canal. That meant a 20,000-mile journey around the Horn of Africa, a distance far beyond what the ships had been designed for. But Nicholas was confident his gamble would pay off. The Baltic fleet was the jewel of the Russian Navy, the diamond in Nicholas's crown, and as we all know, diamond is unbreakable. Only the Tsar had misjudged things. Rather than hard diamond, the Baltic fleet was cubic zirconia, and when it finally reached Japan, it would shatter into a million pieces. Although the Baltic Fleet hastily rechristened the 2nd Pacific Squadron would take months to reach the war, the news of its departure arrived within days. That lit a fire under Japan's Like everyone, Tokyo assumed the Baltic Fleet would throw the advantage to Russia, which meant they had to win now in order to avoid ruinous defeat. So far, autumn 1904 had seen the units attacking Port Arthur hold back from a direct assault. The Russians were dug in tight behind breastworks lined with barbed wire and armed with machine guns. The few times the Japanese had tried advancing, they'd been mown down. Faced with such a mounting death toll, the commanders had switched to laying siege lines. By now, as word of the approaching fleet spread, it was decided a siege would take too long. Port Arthur must fall before the ships arrived. As winter set in, journalists and military observers from Europe's great powers had managed to embed themselves with the Japanese and Russian forces, so they were able to witness firsthand the destructive nature of an infantry assault on machine gun nests. The Japanese tactic at Port Arthur involved throwing scores of men at the fortifications, scores of men who were chewed up by the newfangled guns, dying like flies trying to charge a bug zapper. It was a glimpse of the horrors to come just 10 years later when machine guns would turn World War I's Western Front into a slaughterhouse. But even though the Russians had the guns and supplies to last 3 months, they no longer had the morale to fight. Through the end of 1904, Japanese artillery had bombed the fleet trapped in the harbour until every ship had been wrecked. On January 2nd, 1905, Commander Antony Stressel decided that it was useless. Without telling his officers, he raised the white flag of surrender. Finally, after nearly a year, Port Arthur had fallen, taking Sergei Witte's dream of a warm water port with it. Stressel would later be convicted of treason for his decision to surrender, and no surprise, the fort could have held on longer. But that's all it takes to turn the tide of war. Just one man in a position of minor authority making the wrong call at a key moment. Nor would Stressel be the only Russian officer to screw up. With Port Arthur taken, Tokyo only had one major target, the Manchurian capital of Mukden. Up in their new colonial possession, the Russians were dug in tight at a terminus of their railway, where fresh men reinforced lines that stretched for kilometers. After a pause to get into position, Tokyo launched a final assault on February the 20th. And so began one of the largest land battles in pre-1914 military history. Pitching 340,000 Russians against 260,000 Japanese, the Battle of Mukden lasted 2 weeks, resulting in 164,000 casualties. Prior to World War I, combat on this scale was almost unheard of, and that comparison is telling. As in the fall of Port Arthur, observers again glimpsed the terrifying future. A future of mechanized death, ending lives on an industrial scale. The Battle of Mukden finally ended on March the 10th, with General Kuropatkin sounding the Russian retreat. Do you remember Kuropatkin? He's the guy who also called the retreat back in the Battle of Liaoyang. For quite a lot of people then and now, he's one of the reasons Russia lost the war. An overly timid commander whose only tactics were wait and see, and then quick, run away. Although the Battle of Mukden was a Japanese victory, the Japanese weren't feeling particularly victorious. By now, their forces were exhausted, their supply lines stretched to breaking point, and there was still the Baltic Fleet to deal with. When it finally arrived, you knew what would happen. Well, we know, of course, here in the future with our 2020 hindsight, that, spoiler alert, the fleet's arrival was going to be less the moment that saved Russia's butts and more the final, crowning humiliation. In the end, the Baltic Fleet's voyage took them all the way from early October 1904 to late May 1905. That's 8 months of constant travel through hostile waters in temperatures the ships were never designed for. In all that time, Nicholas's fleet had gone from shining duel to crazy diamond. We sadly don't have time here to go into all the Baltic Fleet's travails, which could make a video in and of itself. The short version, though, is that they limped into the China Sea having spent 9 months in hell, getting into scrapes and generally bumbling around like the nautical equivalent of the Keystone Cops. Finally, though, they were here, heading for the Tsushima Strait that would take them right up to Vladivostok, where other Russian ships were still trapped. First, they just had to get past the entire Japanese navy. On May the 27th, the fleet entered the strait. The Russian ships armed with a mix of batteries, the Japanese mostly carrying big guns with long range. It quickly became apparent which setup was better. The Battle of Tsushima was likely the biggest anticlimax prior to the rise of Skywalker. Over May the 27th, the following night, and the morning of May the 28th, Heihachiro's navy mercilessly pounded the Russians. His tactic was basically to target one ship, throw everything at it, and then target the next ship once the first was sunk. It was crude, but it was brutally effective. On the Japanese side, some 117 were killed and 3 boats sunk. On the Russian side, it was a massacre. Nearly the entire Baltic Fleet wound up on the ocean floor or captured by the Japanese. Over 5,000 Russian sailors died. A mere 3 ships escaped to complete the voyage to Vladivostok. Nicholas's one hope, his crazy diamond, had shattered, leaving only demonic heartbreak. Now, all that was left was to sue for peace. The Battle of Tsushima had ended the Russo-Japanese War. By this point, there had been perhaps 200,000 casualties. In Tokyo, the war's cost had almost bankrupted the government. In St. Petersburg, the disasters at the front had already helped trigger the 1905 Russian Revolution. It was in both sides' interests to settle. So that summer, they met at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in Maine for peace talks brokered by Teddy Roosevelt. Signed in September, the Treaty of Portsmouth would win Roosevelt the Nobel Peace Prize. The treaty killed Russia's imperial dreams in Manchuria, which was returned to China with strict orders that the Tsar's troops evacuate immediately. Japan's influence over Korea was formalized, as was its control of the Liaodong Peninsula, originally won from China back in the First Sino-Japanese War. To sweeten the deal, Tokyo was also given half of Sakhalin Island, a possession it would hold until the end of World War II. Incredibly, though, that was it. When Tsar Nicholas refused to pay an indemnity, Roosevelt sided with him. Despite anti-American riots in Japan, none came. As a dumbfounded New York Times commented, "A nation hopelessly beaten in every battle of the war, one army captured and the other overwhelmingly routed, with a navy swept from the seas, dictated her own terms to the victor. It was a slight from America that Imperial Japan would never forgive. The aftermath of the Russo-Japanese War was in many ways as fascinating as the war itself. In Russia, the 1905 revolution nearly toppled the Tsar, ending, on paper at least, his time as absolute ruler and helping to pave the way for the much more famous revolution in 1917. Japan, meanwhile, became the first Asian country to defeat a European power in the modern era. With such an unexpected victory, the hardline military faction was greatly empowered, a power they would ruthlessly cultivate over the coming decades. Sadly, though, the effective departure of Russia from the region wouldn't change things for the better. While they were underdogs in the war, the depressing truth is that the Japanese Empire was just as cruel, greedy, and racist as any imperialists in Europe. Within 5 years of the Treaty of Portsmouth, Tokyo had annexed Korea and violently suppressed its locals, becoming a pattern of Pacific Empire building that would eventually lead to the atrocities of World War II. Today, the Russo-Japanese War has joined that category of important wars that remain frustratingly little known. Partly that's because it happened so close to a much bigger war that would smash all its grim records, World War I, a war in which Russia and Japan would fight on the same side. Yet for all the conflict may have been overshadowed, its contribution to history was incalculable. It's here that the world first got notice of Imperial Japan's rising might, of the problems besetting Imperial Russia, of the sheer carnage mechanized war would soon unleash. While most of those threats would only pay off years or decades later, it's here that we can see them start to be weaved, entwining into what will soon become a tapestry the bloodiest shade of red, the tapestry of the 20th century.